class itself. My name is Nathan Bjorgi. I have a doctorate in systematic and philosophical theology from the Graduate Theological Union, also a master's degree in the same thing. And I also have a degree in religious studies and philosophy from UC Berkeley, which is just an undergraduate degree. So thanks everybody for indulging me to give this class. I'm hoping to give you kind of a little bit of a graduate seminar experience, although we're going to fine tune as we go to fit people's needs. So do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. This is Esoteric Antecedents of Thelema. We are discussing some historical antecedents to the Thelemic tradition. And for a number of reasons, which I'm going to talk about, we're going to begin in the Renaissance. And the reason for that is because that is, in a way, the beginning of modernity. What might be an obvious question, but maybe isn't so obvious, which is, what is the Renaissance? So the Renaissance is simultaneously the last medieval period, and it's also the first modern period at the same time. So it has this kind of liminal status. It links the past with our present. So when I say that it's the last medieval revival of classical learning, there's several earlier periods of a revival of classical learning in the medieval period. Perhaps the most well-known is in the so-called High Middle Ages of the 13th century, associated with, say, Thomas Aquinas or Albert the Great. This is sometimes called scholasticism, and it involves significant interest in pagan philosophy, particularly Aristotle's philosophy, as a way to address theological issues in Christian culture. So what's happening in the Renaissance is that from their point of view, because of course they don't know that this thing called modernity is about to happen, this is yet another one of these periodic revivals of classical learning and philosophy. It's occurring in Italy, more about what Italy means in a moment. And what's happening is sometimes called humanism. I'll have a little bit more to say about defining exactly what I mean by humanism in the next class when we talk about Pico. For now, it's just another way to talk about this idea of a kind of revival of interest in philosophy and classical learning. What's important about the Renaissance, this is really the moment where this revival begins not just to repeat, but also to surpass its original historical role model, namely classical antiquity. And this is the beginning of the creation of a kind of new sciences and new humanities that are not just going to repeat, but also surpass or be in some way fundamentally different in terms of their themes or contents from the past. And of course, they're at first based on the past, but then new questions start to get asked that weren't asked before. And so there's the development of both a new theory and also practice, a new different understanding of history and what it means to be historical, and therefore a new type of human society based on that understanding. And this all starts in the Renaissance. And this can only really be seen retroactively because, again, people in the Renaissance don't know that this new thing called modernity is happening. So they think of themselves as being part of basically still a traditional agrarian medieval society. But something has fundamentally changed and is in the process of changing. So this raises the interesting question, when does modernity begin? And so that can be kind of broadly placed during this period. One date that's given is in the 1460s when the Byzantine Empire in the East collapsed and was overrun by the Ottoman Turks. And this caused a cultural crisis in Latin Christendom where they were attempting to adjust to that, which causes them to, again, want to be more competitive with what is at that time really the world culture, which is not Christianity, but Islam. And so they're the dominant world culture at this time. And so Latin Christendom is always trying to sort of all through the medieval period, and again in the Renaissance, is trying to sort of catch up and compete with the culture of learning and education that's in the Ottoman Caliphate at this time, which is the major Islamic power. But then something really dramatic happens that dramatically tips the balance of power from this point forward to Western Europe. And this occurs in 1492. And there's actually two things that happen in 1492, both of which are important. One of which all of you already know about, which is the discovery of the so-called New World by Christopher Columbus. And anyone having audio issues? Let me raise my volume a little bit. We'll see if that helps. And then, so in 1492, there are two important things that happen. First of all, there's the discovery of the New World, and therefore the onset of European colonialism. And so what happens is that there's an enormous conquest of the two American continents by first in the South, the Spanish Empire kind of gets off the mark first, but then there's significant competition from them, both by Portugal and then a little bit later by the trading empire that's based in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, which at this time is a possession of the Spanish Empire, but there's a civil war within the Spanish Empire. The Netherlands goes Protestant and breaks away a little bit later. And then they start their own trading empire. And then there's extensive colonization of North America. And then significantly later, but still part of this narrative, the British and the French get into the game. And then these global colonial empires get created in which basically a certain type of Christian imperialism is unleashed on the world. And this is extremely relevant because it provides the context within which so-called Western esotericism, which is going to start in the Renaissance with this person, Marsilio Ficino, that we're going to talk about, acts as kind of the first initial, you could call it a kind of counterculture to the emerging Catholic and Protestant orthodoxies that are going to be in competition over basically globally dominating the entire planet. And these orthodoxies represented on the one hand by Lutheranism and Calvinism in Protestantism, but also by a certain type of Catholic orthodoxy that you could call either the Counter-Reformation. The Jesuits are sort of the intellectual shock troops of that. And you have these intensely authoritarian, repressive, extremely bad political religious systems that are created on a global scale by Christian hegemony. And so what's important about that is that for us as people interested in the Thelemic tradition is that already in the Renaissance, a certain type of pagan magic is intellectually emerging as an alternative to Christian orthodoxy, whether that's Catholic or Protestant. And that's going to continue to persist throughout modernity in a way that basically what I'm saying is that the magical traditions are in a way the first counterculture. They're the first kind of subversive. It's a location, a place for people to have alternative religious or spiritual ideas or motivations that are not simply subsumed to Christian imperialism. And so, of course, not all people who are associated with Western esotericisms are political radicals. Not everybody is William Blake. Not everybody is Aleister Crowley. Not everybody is say Madame Blavatsky and many of the early membership of the Theosophical Society who were involved in the Indian independence movement, for example. But even figures like, say, Emanuel Swedenborg, who seem to be superficially more conventional, turn out to have this really kind of radical element to them, where they're rethinking. So, for example, with Swedenborg, you have the emergence of the first, what you could call an Enlightenment theology, that's then influential on figures like Immanuel Kant or other people who are modernizing spirituality. And so for a long time, these esoteric currents of thought were very much marginalized. But more recently in the 20th century, the importance of these types of thought has reemerged in scholarship. And the major work that did that came out in the 1960s and is this book by Francis Yates, of which one of the chapters was included in the readings. And it's entitled Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition. And basically what Francis Yates, what she argues is that the historians had underestimated the importance of occult or what she calls Hermetic thought in the Renaissance as the basis for then what becomes modern science, basically, and also modern science that's critical of religious orthodoxy, that's willing to think out of the box, and that some of the first people to do that are in the Renaissance. So in particular, she's focusing on this somewhat later figure named Giordano Bruno that we're not really going to be talking about in this class. But she begins, first of all, by talking about this person, Marsilio Ficino. Oh yes, I almost forgot. There's one other thing that happens in 1492 that's very important, in fact critical, which is that in addition to the discovery of the New Worlds and the beginning of the plundering of the world by European colonialism, the other thing that happens in the Spanish Empire is that there's the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. Now that might at first seem to be unrelated, but in fact, it's very important because at the very beginning of modernity, we have the emergence of the beginning of what's going to become a new type of ethnocentric category. And I refer to the concept of race, which is a radically historical category that does not really exist in the form that we understand and experience it as in either ancient times or the medieval period, but is distinctively associated with the emergence of European colonialism. And it kind of achieves its mature form in the late 18th and early 19th centuries in specifically the British Empire. And although eventually the focus is on differentiating supposedly white people from supposedly Black people to enforce a kind of racial hierarchy based around the Atlantic slave trade, the first emergence kind of in the modern period of this type of differentiation is the distinction between Christians and Jews in Western Europe and the politicization of that. And kind of the most intensive beginning of that is with the expulsion of the Jews in the Spanish Empire, where they move away from just the medieval type of discomfort with Jews being around to, no, we're actually going to get rid of these people and they're not, they're in this other kind of category. So what's important about that is that it links the beginning of the creation of whiteness with the beginning of colonialism and also the beginning of modernity at about, say, 1492 or slightly earlier. So what's important about that is that it links the history of Western esotericism, and I'm going to be arguing over the course of this class, also the creation of Thelema itself in the early 20th century to a larger anti-colonial struggle. And so when Crowley is articulating his own position as a kind of post-Christian philosophy and is critical of Christianity, he's specifically critical of Christianity in the context of the British colonial Christian empire and its colonial project. Because remember, as he's coming to maturity, he's very much part of that empire when it's at its height. And what I want to do is I want to be linking that to earlier earlier moments when esotericism is used to gain a certain critical distance towards this type of larger colonial project, because my ultimate argument is going to be that far from being some kind of conservative philosophy, Thelema is in fact fundamentally concerned to critique the conditions of globalized colonial capitalism. And that is either implicit or explicit at various points. And by going back to the Renaissance, where this all begins, some of these issues can become a little bit more clear. So, for example, the Renaissance is occurring mostly in Italy, but that's a little bit of a misnomer because there's no such thing. What's going on is that just like there's no Germany at this time, there's also no Italy, because what we call Italy is divided up into little principalities or city-states. And in fact, what we think of as the national state of Italy doesn't come about until 1871, which is centuries later than the time period we're in. In fact, it's a little bit wrong and misleading to refer to countries at this time as nations. What we should really refer to them as is something more like commonwealths. And they're typically owned basically as the feudal property of certain members of the nobility, and they're traded around by marriage. And so the big emerging power at this time is the Spanish Empire. And this is because there's been a union of two kingdoms within, again, what we think of as Spain, but isn't really Spain because there isn't such a thing as Spain. Really, it's an artificial amalgamation of these little territories, specifically the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. And there's a uniting of the crowns by the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella. And they get married and they unite these two kingdoms, and then they push out the remaining Muslims that are in Spain, because remember, Spain was Islamic for 1,000 years. It was part of the caliphate. And then there's what's called the Reconquista, where Ferdinand and Isabella create a Christian kingdom in the north of Spain, and they lead a series of wars that finally push out and eventually expel all the Muslims from Spain. And then the New World is discovered. And then there's a series of conquests of the Aztec and Incan people, but also other territories in South and Mesoamerica. And then suddenly Spain is this world empire. And all this cash and money is coming into Europe. And that fuels modernity, because suddenly the Europeans are wealthier than anybody else in the world. And that's prefigured a little bit by some of the mercantile empires, say in Venice and so forth. So there's this particularly wealthy family by the name of the Medicis. And the great scion of that family is this fellow Cosimo Medici. And what he does in 1460, he sends some agents to Greece, which again is not called Greece, and people there don't think of themselves as part of a nation called Greece. They call themselves Romans. And people in Italy, they also call themselves Romans, because again, there's no Italy and there's no Greece yet. But anyway, so he sends some agents over to Greece, and they're looking for manuscripts, and they go to this monastery and they're digging around, and they just make this amazing find. They discover some manuscripts that have been completely lost in Latin Europe for the whole of the Middle Ages, basically since the end of Rome. And what they discover is they discover the complete works of Plato and this other text called the Corpus Hermetica, which is this famous magical text that's referred to by other writers, but they didn't actually have the text of it. And it's supposedly written by this magician by the name of Hermes Trismegistus. And Trismegistus means the 3 times great. So he's Hermes, the 3 times great. Ficino also sometimes calls him Mercurius. And so, of course, Hermes is the same as Mercury, the Roman Mercury, who's the god of magic. So he's this figure of magical wisdom. So, and there's this text that's associated with him, and they've recovered it. And this happens in 1460. And so it's brought back to Florence, where Cosimo Medici has this scholar that's he's the patron of. a fellow by the name of Marsilio Ficino. And he hands these texts over to Ficino to translate, and they get translated into Latin, and it creates an intense revival. It kind of is one of the major things that fuels the Renaissance, in the sense that it creates this intense revival of interest in pagan learning, because finally they have not just Aristotle's texts, which had been recovered centuries earlier, but now suddenly they have the whole Platonic corpus. So they finally have a copy of the Republic. They have a copy of the Symposium. They have a copy of the Phaedrus. They have a copy of all these texts that everybody knew about, but they didn't actually have. And now they have them. So Ficino is given the job of, because he's a humanist scholar, and so he knows all these languages, he knows Greek, and so he's given the task of translating these texts. But Cosimo Medici gives an instruction, because Cosimo's in his old age and he's sick and he knows he's going to be dying soon. And so he tells Ficino to hold off translating the dialogues of Plato because they're not so important. Really, the important text that he wants to read before he dies is the Corpus Hermetica. That's the really important thing that he wants to read. And so Ficino sets aside the dialogues of Plato, which have been unknown in Latin West and everybody wants to take a look at, to instead translate this other text that everybody thinks is for some reason more important, and I'll get to that, called the Corpus Hermetica. Why did they think the Corpus Hermetica was more important than the dialogues of Plato? The reason is because they thought that the Corpus, they thought that Hermes Trismegistus was a contemporary of Moses, and that they thought that the first 5 books of the Bible were written by Moses, and that the account of the creation in Genesis was based on the account of the creation in the Corpus Hermetica. And so they thought that the Corpus Hermetica was actually the oldest, like, wisdom text, that it predated the Torah, that it predated the dialogues of Plato, that it was what Ficino calls the Prisca Theologica, or Theologia, the pristine theology of ancient times. And so this was the great source of wisdom. Now, it turns out that they misdated the text. And in 1614, a fellow by the name of Isaac Casaubon correctly dated the Corpus Hermetica as being a text from about maybe about the 1st century of the Common Era, maybe towards the end of that century, maybe a little bit in the 2nd century, sometime from around then. And the reason that the creation myth we're going to read in a few minutes that is in the Corpus Hermetica, the reason this seems to be similar to the book of Genesis is because the author of the Corpus Hermetica had read the book of Genesis and is basing it on that. And the reason it's similar to certain things that are in Plato is because the author of the Corpus Hermetica had read Plato and is basing it on that. So it actually goes the other way around. It's not that Plato and Genesis are based on the Corpus Hermetica, it's that the Corpus Hermetica is based on Genesis and Plato, and they've gotten it reversed. But that's okay, because what happened is that it created a whole revival of interest in pagan magic in the Renaissance, and a whole kind of subculture around this. And this is what Francis Yates calls the Hermetic Revival. And this is really important because it's basically the antecedent of the type of occultism or magic that Thelema is based on. And that's why the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn is called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, is because it's looking back to the Hermeticism of the Renaissance as the source for its own magical theory. And so this is the kind of origin point of the type of magic that's being practiced in the Golden Dawn, which then when Crowley gets initiated in that and learns magic, that's the kind of magic that he learns. And then that's the type of magic that's part of the Thelemic magical system. And so this is the source of our tradition in a way. So anyway, in 1463, Ficino completes his translation of the Hermetica. Cosimo Medici dies in 1464, so he did have time to read it. And then subsequently in 1469, Ficino completes his translation of Plato. Although it's not, in fact, published until 1484, but most of these texts circulated manuscript before they're officially published. So people do have access to it before that. Ficino wrote extensive commentaries on Plotinus, on Plato. He has a whole Platonic theology, very interesting text where he comments on all of these texts. And so he's at the same time a translator, he's a mystic, he's a magician, and he's a philosopher. So he combines all of these things kind of in one package. And what's important about him is that he represents really the ideal of what Francis Yates calls the ideal of the Renaissance magus, of the magician who's also a philosopher, who's also a scholar, who's a man of the world, who represents everything positive and advanced about culture and learning. But it has this magical spiritual focus, trying to become where you're learning, using your own capacities to fulfill your full human capacity in a proactive way, rather than waiting to be the passive recipient of grace, which is more the Christian, particularly the Protestant ideal later. So it's a more proactive image of spirituality than the more closed-minded, authoritarian versions of Christian orthodoxy that are about to sort of take over a little bit later. And that's because the Renaissance, in a way, comes to an end in 1494. And this dating I get from, by the way, if you want a really good book on the Renaissance, I highly recommend The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy by Jacob Burckhardt, who was a contemporary of Nietzsche's. This is actually a 19th century work, but it's a great classic. It was published in 1860. It's an older book, but it's a very good one about the Renaissance, and affected much of the later scholarship, including Yates's own scholarship on the subject. And Burckhardt argues that the Renaissance basically comes to an end in 1494 because the Spanish Empire at that point invades Italy. And all of the internal little sub-states within Italy are always at war with each other. And so at one point, one of them makes the mistake of inviting the Spanish crown to send some troops in to help them with a war with one of the other city-states. And the Spanish are like, well, we're just gonna move in and take over, basically. And so they take over most of the southern part of the peninsula, what at that time is called the Kingdom of Naples, is directly incorporated into the Spanish Empire as a fief of the emperor. But in practice, all of the peninsula is then militarily occupied and controlled by the Spanish Empire. And the problem with that is that in 1517, this fellow that you've all heard of by the name of Martin Luther nails up the 95 Theses in Germany, and the Reformation gets underway. And then the Spanish Empire declares itself to be the enemy of the Reformation. They're going to be the upholders of Catholic orthodoxy. And so this thing called the Counter-Reformation begins, which is an absolutely authoritarian political movement that completely imposes basically blanket censorship on everything that's going on in Italy. And it basically shuts down the type of creative thought and learning that's going on in Italy. And so the type of thought in the Renaissance continues, but the center of gravity of that and of scholarship and of the type of new thinking and that emerges that we now call modernity, the center of gravity of that moves out of Italy and now moves into the space of Protestantism, particularly in Northern and Western Europe. And so places like Amsterdam now become the place where you can publish your philosophical tracts, where they're not just going to be censored and you wind up getting denounced and arrested by the Jesuits. So the Renaissance and modernity starts in Italy, but then it gets politically shut down by the Spanish Empire, and then things have to kind of move to a different place in Europe. So what's so important then about someone like Ficino, who, by the way, dies in 1499. So Ficino's dates are 1433 to 1499. So what's important about him is that just before the Reformation happens and the religious wars between the Protestants and the Catholics break out, and there's these hyper-orthodoxies that come into play, the first breakthrough to this new type of modern spirituality is happening with our person, Marsilio Ficino. So what I want to do is I want to take a look at the actual Corpus Hermetica. We're going to read together the first book. But before I do that, I just want to talk a little bit about Ficino's own magical philosophy. And this is particularly laid out in a book called The Book of Life, which is actually 3 separate books. Ficino, in addition to being a Catholic priest, was also a medical doctor. One of these Renaissance figures who seems to have learned everything. So anyway, he's writing this book that's about basically using magic to improve your health through the use of like astral talismans, where you call down the influences of the heavens to bring more of the influence of usually like Venus, Jupiter, and the sun to give you good health that counterbalances the more ambiguous influences of, say, Mars or Saturn, which are not bad per se, but out of balance, they can create problems with they'll imbalance your humors in your body. And so you need to use these sort of astral influences to correct that. But in this book, he lays out his theory of magic, and he does it in a particularly interesting way because he has a particular problem that he has to address, which is that magic has a bad rap at this time. And it does throughout the medieval period as well. And the reason is because the popular belief is that magical actions are affected through summoning demonic spirits, which then do your bidding. And of course, the classic example of this is the Goetia, which we think of as a medieval text, but is actually a Baroque English collection. It's actually a Baroque text from England from later than this, but anyway, it does refer to these earlier types of magical traditions. So Ficino, if he wants to promote his idea of natural magic, needs to get away from the idea that he's summoning spirits who might potentially be evil spirits to do these workings for him. So he has an alternative theory that he gets from Platonism and he gets from the Corpus Hermetica. And this is the idea that the universe has a soul. The universe is an ensouled being. And he calls this the anima mundi, literally the soul of the world. This is an idea that comes from the, in ancient Roman philosophy, there's this kind of fusion of Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy. And it's represented both in the Corpus Hermetica, but it's also represented in the relatively more Aristotelian Stoic tradition. And Aristotle has this idea that the entire universe is bounded and enclosed in this crystalline sphere, the sphere of the fixed stars. And so the stars, as it were, are these ensouled spirits that are embedded in this giant sphere. And the sphere rotates around once per day, which is why the stars move. And then outside that sphere, time and space don't exist. So the universe is enclosed in this gigantic sphere. Now, this is very large. It's about the size maybe of about the solar system, but it's radically smaller than we now consider the universe to be. But at the time, they thought that the universe was very big, but it was finite and it was bounded, and had been the Christian tradition thought that it was created in time about 5,000 years ago. The Aristotle thought that it was eternal and that it had always existed. But in any case, he thought that the planets were in these crystal spheres that moved, and that the reason they moved was that they were ensouled. And according to Aristotle's conception, matter is this kind of bare, immediate presence, but it only has the qualities that it does because it has a form. And the form that it has is its soul. So you have some object, and its bare material presence is its prime matter, but that it has its various properties, that it's hard to the touch, that it has a particular color. These are all because it has a particular form, and its form is in virtue of it having a soul. It's been ensouled with a form. And these are Plato's forms that for Aristotle are infused with material substance to give everything the shape and appearance that it does. So it's what Aristotle calls an internal principle of life or motion. So our bodies, according to this, have a soul. And then in virtue of having this soul, our bodies have a particular form that have certain capacities. So we have the capacity to grow, we have the capacity to move on our own initiative, and also we are able to think. And this property of thinking, of rational thought, is called nous, or mind, which is an important word that'll come up in the Corpus Hermetica. And this is the most divine aspect of form. There's a kind of hierarchy of properties. So first there's the nutritive property that you can just sustain your bare life and grow, and plants have that. But then there's the property of being able to move around, and animals have that. But then the rational aspect of the soul, that's something that human beings and gods have preeminently. So anyway, the entire universe has a soul, which is why it can rotate around once per day. It can do that because it has an internal principle of motion, which is a form, which is a soul. So the entire universe is alive, but that means everything within that crystal sphere is permeated by this form, by this world soul. And for Ficino, that's how magic works. Because, and his example is like when you have a magnet and it attracts something, that's because the medium that affects that effect so that it will move, that's because of the world soul, is this mediating influence that allows for the magnet to attract things. And our bodies are also permeated by this world soul. So we both have a personal soul, but we're also part of or linked to the world soul. And so that's why talismans can draw down influences from heaven, is because the influence is mediated by the anima solis, by the world soul. And that allows Ficino's magic to be theologically acceptable because he's not using demonic spirits to cause things to happen. It's just a kind of like natural property of things, like in, say, natural science, like in physics, that they just have these natural properties in virtue of the world soul. So it's a kind of prototype of modern science, you see. Now, he also thinks that there are also spirits that you can communicate with and you can get to do things. But this is how he's able to kind of clean up his magic and make it acceptable to Christian orthodoxy. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to look at the, oops, has this disappeared? Let me take a look here, just a sec. Okay. Just a moment. Here we go. I'm going to share my screen, and you should now all see a copy of the Corpus Hermetica on your screen. And this is book 1. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to call on people based on my list. And then when I call on you, if you'll unmute your mic and read each numbered section in turn. So the first person I call on, you'll read section 1, and then the next person will read section 2. And we'll comment one.
Okay. Once when mind has become intent on the things which are, my understanding was raised to a great height, while my bodily senses were withdrawn as in sleep, when men are weighed down by too much food or by fatigue of the body. It seemed that someone immensely great of infinite dimensions happened to call my name and said to me, "What do you wish to hear and behold? And having beheld, what do you wish to learn and know?"
All right, Lana, if you could read number 2.
Who are you? Said I. He said, I am Poimandres, the news, the news of the Supreme. I know where you wish, and I'm with you everywhere.
Okay, I'm going to comment on this now. Nous is, of course, our word about reason. It's the highest aspect of form or soul. So this is the ultimate reason of the perhaps the world soul. So basically what's happening here is that the speaker is Hermes Trismegistus, is the author of this text. And he's now gotten communication with this higher spirit that is now communicating the gnosis to him. So this is what this basically is his own holy guardian angel, his higher and divine spirit, which is now going to communicate the gnosis to him. So in our own terms, Poimandres is the name of Hermes Trismegistus's holy guardian angel. Now, Ficino in the Book of Life alludes to this doctrine. Let me read this to you. So Ficino says, he says, whoever is born of sound mind has been naturally intended by heaven for some honest work and some kind of life. Whoever therefore wishes heaven to be good to him will go after this work and this kind of life and doggedly pursue it, for heaven favors things it has itself begun. You are made by nature for this purpose beyond anything else. What you do from your tender years on, what you talk about, mold, fit, dream, imitate, what you try very often, what you can do easily, what you are most good at, what you love beyond all else. Clearly, what heaven and the rector of heaven bore you for. To this extent, therefore, heaven will favor your beginnings and will smile on your life as much as you pursue the signs of this creator, especially if that Platonic saying is true, which all antiquity agreed that there is a certain daimon guardian for life for everyone who is born, bound by one's own star itself. In order for him to help someone in this duty of life, the heavenly beings assign him to each person being born. So there's a guardian daimon or spirit that's assigned to each of us at birth by the divine hierarchy of the cosmos that mediates or communicates the gnosis and wisdom to us. If this sounds familiar, it's because it's the doctrine of the whole guardian angel in Thelema. This is the ancient antecedent of that. And then that gets picked up again in the Renaissance, and then that gets picked up again by the Golden Dawn and by Crowley in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so there's this thread that runs from ancient times to the present of this particular idea. Okay, is Joe Monteleone here?
Yep.
Could you read number 3?
Number 3, I wish to learn, said I, the things that are and understand their nature and to know God. Oh, how I wish to hear these things. He spoke to me again, hold in your nous all that you wish to learn, and I will teach you.
Okay, when God is referred to in this, it does not mean the monotheistic God of the Christian or Jewish Bible. It does not necessarily mean a personal deity. It just means the ultimately spiritual ground of reality. What Plato calls sort of the ultimate form of the true, the good, and the beautiful, the ultimate archetypal basis for those things in reality. So when it says God, it now Ficino, when he's reading this, he says, oh, that's God like in the Bible, right? Well, that's not actually what this text means. But anyway, that's how it gets interpreted by the Christians at this time. Okay, if you could read number 4.
Okay. When he had thus spoken, he changed in form, and forthwith, upon the instant, all things opened up before him, and I beheld a boundless view. All had become light, a gentle and joyous light, and I was filled with longing when I saw it. After a little while, there had come to be in one part a downward moving darkness, fearful and loathsome, which I experienced as a twisting and unfolding motion. Thus it appeared to me. I saw the nature of the darkness change into a watery substance, which was indescribably shaken about and it gave out smoke as from fire, culminating in an unutterable mournful echo. There was sent forth from the watery substance a loud, inarticulate cry. The sound, as I thought, was of the light.
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, great. If you could read number 5, please.
Out of the light came forth the holy word, which entered into the watery substance, and pure fire leapt from the watery substance and rose up. The fire was insubstantial, piercing and active. The air, being light, followed the breath and mounted up till it reached the fire, away from the earth and water, so that it seemed to be suspended from the fire. The earth and water remained in their own place, mingled together, so that they could not be distinguished, and they were kept in motion by the breath of the word, which passed over them within hearing.
Okay, so if this sounds similar in a little bit to the book of Genesis with the spirit hovering over the waters, there's a literary influence here from Genesis. But basically, this is a repeat of something like the basic Gnostic myth, which is that there's a kind of primal light and darkness that are in strife with each other, and their interaction and influence with each other gives rise to the cosmos. And then the different elements, fire, water, earth, and air, separate out from each other. And there's a kind of persistence of the primordial spirit as a kind of quintessence described as a light or nous or mind that persists as the world soul that binds all of this together. Amanda, could you read number 6?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you great.
Poimandres spoke to me and said, "Have you understood what you have seen and what it means?" "I shall come to know it," I said. "That light," he said, "is I, Nu, your God, who was before the watery substance which appeared out of the darkness. And the clear word from Nu is the Son of God." "How can this be?" I said, or said I. "Know this," he said, "that which sees and hears within you is the word of the Lord, and Nu is the God the Father. They are not separate from each other, for their union is life." "Thank you," I said, "but perceive the light and know it," said Poimandres.
Okay, so we have the phrase the Father and the Son of God. Okay, obviously this is from like the Gospel of John or so forth. However, this is not a Christian text, and so these don't refer to God the Father and Jesus Christ as the Son. Instead, what's being referred to is the Platonic ideal of the kind of primordial one or unity of being is the Father. And then there's the emergence of and then there's the emergence of the what's called the Logos, which is the basis for the proliferation of forms or the souls and the informing of structure of the structuring of the universe. So in Kabbalistic terms, this would be Kether as the primordial unity. Everybody check that you've got your mics off. And then Hokmah as the Logos. So these then are the kind of primordial pair. Now the Logos is also embodied as the holy guardian angel or as Poimandres, who's the again mediating between the ultimate unity of being and Hermes Trismegistus, the sage who's having this conversation. So again, this is kind of like a knowledge and conversation. And the importance of this is that he says that which sees and hears within you, in other words, your own reason, your own self-consciousness, is the divine Logos, is not separate from that. And so the divinity is within you. It's not just in another world or before time. It's embodied in your own existence. And if you know that, then you yourself become a divine being. And that's the gnosis. That's the gnosis that's being communicated in this text. And again, if that sounds familiar to our own traditions, it's because this is that this is the basis of our own tradition, is this doctrine. And this text is about 2,000 years old. And so were people basically practicing a version of knowledge and conversation with the Holy Guardian Angel and having these visions and doing all this stuff 2,000 years ago? The answer is yes, they were, and we're continuing that. And so, again, this is kind of the purpose of this class, is to reawaken to ourselves that we're part of this larger historical conversation of trajectory. What we're doing isn't from yesterday. We're part of a thousands of years old tradition that gets lost and then refound at different. If you could read number 7.
Yeah, number 7. And when he had thus spoken, he looked at me full in the face for a long time, so that his form made me tremble. When he had looked up, I saw in my own nous that the light was in innumerable powers, having become an infinite world. I saw a fire encompassed by a mighty power, being under command to keep its place. I was intent upon these things, seeing them by means of the word of Poimandres.
Okay, so Poimandres, who's the word, who's the logos, is the nous that communicates the ground of being, is our own nous, is our own ability, is our own self-consciousness, is our own self-awareness of our own existence. These are all the same. They're all linked together. They're the basis for our own sense of our own self-conscious awareness of our own divinity, of our own, what Crowley would call our true will, our purpose, which is then communicated to us by, see, that's why Ficino in the Book of Life is saying, well, you've got this life purpose, you've got these things you're supposed to do, and there's been this guardian spirit that's appointed to you, that's supposed to help you with that, that's supposed to communicate this to you. That's what Crowley calls the true will, which is this purpose to your life that's communicated in knowledge and conversation with the Holy Guardian Angel. It's all the same concept. It's all the same idea. Number 8.
As I stood amazed, Poimandres spoke again to me, saying, "You saw in nous the first form, which is prior to the beginning of the beginningless and endless." Thus spoke Poimandres to me. And I said, "Whence did the elements of nature have their origins?" He answered, "From the will of God, which holding the word and seeing the beautiful cosmos, made one exactly like it, fashioned from her own constituent elements of the offspring of souls."
Okay, great. And remember, souls are forms, which are also the form of matter. And so nature is imprint, which is also the world soul, because remember, nature is alive. It's its own soul. And then it's imprinted by the divine nous with all of these forms, and then it comes alive and takes on the form that it does. So you have several kind of figures here. You've got nature, which is alive and is the world soul and is divine and holds all these powers within it. And then you've got the Father, which is the absolute ground of being, is the source and seed of the forms. And then you've got mediating between these two is the Logos, which then imprints the forms into nature. So you could say, well, that's Kether, Hokmah, and Bina. Or you could say that's being, Logos, and Sophia. Or again, these systems are all cognate. Lana, if you could read 9.
Nous, God, being male and female, beginning as life and light, gave birth by the word to another nous, the creator of the world. He, being the God of fire and air, formed 7 powers who encompass in their circles the sensory world, and the governance of these powers is called destiny.
Okay, so the 7 powers of the 7 planets, and they form these spheres, and then that further gives structure to what is called the sensory world, the universe. And then they govern over destiny. And of course, you can affect that. You can know that destiny through astrology. And then through astral magic, you can affect or manipulate that destiny so that you're not just subsumed to it. And again, all of this is communicated then by nous through the intermediary of the Logos through your guardian daimon. Joe, if you could read number 10.
Okay, number 10. Immediately the word of God leapt forth from the downward moving elements to the pure work of the Creator, and was united with the Creator Nous, for he was of the same substance. And the downward moving elements of the creation were left behind, without the Word, to be matter alone.
So there's this kind of reverberation. So this creation occurs, and then there's also, but then there's a kind of withdrawing of the light so that things can be separate from it. Luke, could you read number, I think we're on 11.
Nous, the Creator, together with the Word, encompassing the spheres and spinning them around with a rushing motion, caused those things he had made to revolve, and he allowed them to revolve from no fixed beginning to no end without limit. For it begins where it ends. The rotation of these spheres, as Nous willed, brought forth from the downward moving elements living beings without speech, for they did not contain the Word. And the air produced winged creatures, and the water swimming creatures. The earth and the water were separated from each other, as Nous willed, and the earth brought forth from herself what she possesses: four-footed animals, reptiles, beasts, wild and tame.
Okay, the literary influence from Genesis should be obvious. But again, this is just a further differentiation of the, as everything now starts to rotate and move and operate. And notice it says from no fixed beginning to an end without limit. And the idea here is that the creation occurs from outside of space and time. And so that within space and time, these actually exist eternally. So for Aristotle, there was no beginning to time within time. The beginning of time and space are from outside of time and space, if that makes any sense. It's a little bit different than the more traditional Judeo-Christian notion of creation, where there's a specific creation in time from the point of view of us within time. Anyway, that's a little bit complicated, but I just wanted to mention that that's a feature of the text. I think we're, is it Luke who's next to read 12, or did you just go? If you could.
I just went.
Okay, let's do James then.
I can go.
We're on 12, you said?
I think so, yes.
Yeah. Nous, the Father of all, who is light and life, brought forth man, the same as himself, whom he loved as his own child. For man was very beautiful, bearing the image of his Father. It was really his own form that God loved, and he handed over him to all his creation.
Okay, so this is like the creation of Adam. There's a single human person who's been created. And although it says man, this is before gender. So just like Nous is both male and female, or both or neither, so this first person hasn't been gender differentiated yet. And let's see. And so the idea here is that human beings, because we share the same form as the ground of being, we're identical also in a way with God, quote unquote, or the ground of being, because we share the same form. We both have Nous, this soul or mind. Okay, Amanda, if you could read 13.
When man had observed in the Father the creation of the Creator, he himself wished to create, and he was given permission to do so by the Father. Being begotten in the sphere of the Creator, he observed carefully the creations of his brother, and from which he obtained every power. The Father and the brother loved him, and each gave him of their own authority. Having acquired knowledge of their essence and partaking in their nature, he wished to break through the circumference of the spheres and to come to know the power of him who was set in authority over fire.
Okay, so the Father and the brother are the Father and the Son, meaning being and the Logos. And so partaking of their nature, the first human being who's the archetype of all the future human beings wants then to acquire the gnosis, to then raise themselves back up to know the absolute. So then, of course, the idea is that the Hermeticist is going to follow that same procedure. Anyway, we're running a little short on time, and I want to leave some time for questions. This is basically the idea of the text. There's more stuff, but it basically repeats these ideas. So rather than spend more time on the text, there's all kinds of other interesting things about that. And there's a dozen more Hermetic texts like this that include all kinds of other interesting additional ideas. This class is just kind of a teaser so you can see how these ideas work. So I'm going to now unshare my screen, go back to the main one, and let's have some Q&A and discussion about what we've been talking about. So I'm just going to sort of throw it open here. If anybody has a question, kind of take the initiative and unmute your mic and ask away. I want to answer any question about Renaissance, Ficino, Corpus Hermetica, this class, etc.
I have a question, Nathan.
Yes, please go ahead.
Would you just go back over where you were saying and who like Poimandres was representing and Nous, and how you were saying this was like the HGA, this was this. Can you just say that again so I can write
Yes,
it?
there's kind of three characters
Yeah.
in this. So there's Hermes Trismegistus, who's the supposed author or speaker of the text. And he represents the individual magician, or say, seeker after truth, or Hermetic magician. You're supposed to model yourself on this character. And then he's in conversation with this spirit being called Poimandres. So Poimandres is the higher divine self, is the guardian daimon, is the holy guardian angel. And Poimandres is then in a further relationship with this figure that's called the Father. The Father is pure being, or pure nous, or you could say the ground of being, an impersonal, ultimate divine principle, meaning not a personal God. So you can't directly communicate with the Father for that reason. You need this intermediary figure. Nous, or the Father, or the pure being, and then Poimandres is sometimes called the Son of God, or is sometimes called the brother in the text. These are all cognate terms. He's given the name Poimandres, and then you have the speaker of the text, Hermes Trismegistus. So those are the three main figures. Now there's kind of a fourth figure that was alluded to that gets talked about a bit more later in the text, and in some, which is nature, which is the world soul, the anima mundi, that is then imprinted with the forms of nous, and is therefore also a kind of divine figure that you can relate to, but is also then the medium within which you can affect magic, because it's also the world spirit that mediates and connects all these seemingly separate objects. So I'm here, you're over there, but we're connected through the world soul. Nature is this kind of medium that connects us, and so we can be in communication with each other through that medium. And we could also magically affect each other or other objects through the mediation of the world soul. That's the kind of magical theory of Hermeticism. Is that pretty clear, or at least?
No, very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. A question. Anybody else have a question?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
What translation is this, and is this the one you would recommend? Because it's I have this
Yes.
one, but this one's not as cool as that one.
Yes, this is a wonderful translation that was done by Inner Traditions just a few years ago. It's called The Way of Hermes. I highly recommend it. It includes all of the basic Corpus Hermetica texts translated into English. These texts are originally written in Koine Greek, which is the same Greek that the New Testament is written in. And it's the kind of common trade, international spoken Greek form of the Greek language that's spoken within the Roman Empire kind of in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, which is of course when this text is from. So again, the title is The Way of Hermes. If you go to Amazon, look that up, it's published by Inner Traditions, it'll come up. This was published in the 1990s, but I think it's still commonly available. This does exclude one other important Hermetic text, which is called the Asclepius. I'm happy to email everybody bibliography and stuff like that. We'll do that later in the week during the class, after the class is over. What's important about the Asclepius is that it talks about a particular magical practice where you have a statue of a god and you use spells to cause a daimon to inhabit that statue. And then the statue will talk to you and you can communicate with it that way. And it can like give you oracles or answer questions that you have or whatever. And this leads to the later medieval tradition that you would have like a brass head that you would say spells on and it would talk to you. And so it's the origin of that tradition. And Ficino talks a bit about that. The Asclepius actually doesn't exist in an originally, we've lost the original Koine Greek text of that. It only exists in a Latin version and wasn't recovered with the original collection of the Corpus Hermetica in the Renaissance. And then there are a few other fragments of so-called Hermetic texts that were in fact found with the Nag Hammadi documents later in the 20th century, which included a number of Gnostic texts and included also some Hermetic texts from this particular tradition. It's thought that these texts represent some kind of basically magical society or order that people were part of, probably located in Alexandria in Egypt, but it may have also been in other locations. And it was a magical society that you were initiated into. And they had maybe 8 initiatory grades that corresponded to an ascent through the planetary spheres. And they practiced magic. And these are their texts that you were given in your initiation. And so again, the point here is that it's very similar to what we're doing. In a way, this is the ancient version of this. They're kind of the same message. Now, of course, the Thelemic tradition has 2,000 years of additional philosophical development that it can draw upon. And so when we get a little later in the course and we're talking about what's called Middle Platonism, which is the type of Platonism that the Corpus Hermetica articulates, I'll begin to introduce some more criticism of that philosophy and talk about the way that Thelema introduces some additional philosophical thought that maybe advances the ball a little bit with that. But for today, for our purposes, I'm just mostly focusing on those similarities. Any other questions? Eric, go ahead.
Yeah. Can you comment at all about, say, Kabbalistic influences here or cross-pollination? Is that?
Yes, the Sefer Yetzirah, which we're going to look at a little later in this course, is roughly contemporaneous, with the Corpus Hermetica, meaning early Common Era in the Roman Empire, probably Jews in North Africa, maybe even in kind of Alexandria or that area, because that's really the center of learning at this time. And also because people in Egypt at that time are aware that there's this earlier magical civilization in ancient Egypt. And so the kind of mystery cults that are going on in Egypt are alluding to or looking back to that earlier tradition. And so there's this kind of Egyptian Gnosticism, if you will, that emerges at that time in that context, and it's then subsequently very influential. Kabbalah is interesting because it's emerging at this time within the rabbinical tradition. There's an enormous amount of hybridity of cross currents and connection between what subsequently get taken as to be separate traditions, but are really more interconnected at this time culturally, whether that's Judaism or paganism or Christianity, particularly in the context of these so-called Gnostic traditions. The people involved in that are really drawing from all of these traditions. And so what we call the Kabbalah, particularly represented by this very early text, the Sefer Yetzirah, which comes from this period, is kind of derives from the part of the what's emerging as the rabbinical tradition that's in conversation with these Gnostic, magical, Hermetic, Platonic types of discourse. The Talmud, and which is getting compiled around this time, has a lot of this stuff that's kind of just, the Talmud is this enormous depository for all of this cultural material that just kind of gets, it's like this filing cabinet, this halakhic commentary where all this stuff gets just, all this diverse cultural material gets sort of stuffed into the different filing drawers to relate to the different conversations that are going on in that text. And so what the Sefer Yetzirah represents is a kind of like summarization of this type of discourse. And like the Corpus Hermetica, it's intended to be like, it's meant to be used in a study group. It's meant to be like we're doing now. It's right currently. It's meant to be something that you would sit down with a bunch of other people and you go through the different sections and then you elaborate them in conversation. And which is why it has a kind of abbreviated form, not kind of unlike the Talmud itself, which it has this kind of odd rhetorical style where it's almost like the thoughts don't seem to be fully completed because it's meant to be filled in when you're talking about it at the Beit Midrash, or the when you're actually sitting down with the rabbis and you're discussing these rulings, you like have almost these little like clips, that these slogans that you refer to that then refer to these whole larger discourses or dialogues. And that's also the case with the Corpus Hermetica, where it's really referring to this larger, more complex religious tradition represented by the Book of Genesis or the Platonic dialogues or whatever. And it hits on these connecting points, but then you're supposed to kind of fill in the larger myth within your initiatory society that you're part of. It's meant to be part of this larger community. If that answers your question a little bit.
More than answers, thank you.
Yeah, we're going to get to the Sefer Yetzirah, which is an extremely important text because the Golden Dawn's system of correspondences, which are then the basis for the basis for 777. The reason there's 32 as the number of the different little rows in 777, it's because that's the 10 Sephirot and 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, whose correspondences are originally given in the Sefer Yetzirah. So the Sefer Yetzirah is the basis for the Golden Dawn's correspondence system, and then the system that we're still using 2,000 years later in the Thelemic magical tradition. So all this stuff goes back centuries and centuries and centuries, and then it gets lost, and then it gets rediscovered, and then it gets lost again, and then it gets rediscovered again. And this process just keeps repeating. The point that I'm going to be sort of returning to in different ways as we proceed through this course is the specific contribution that I think Thelema specifically is making to this conversation is to update all of these ideas for a specifically modern, like industrialized modern context, where we don't have the same cultural experience as kind of these earlier epochs. And so all these ideas have to, in a way, get updated. And what does that mean? Well, Thelema is an attempt to articulate what that might mean. Any other questions? We've got about 5 minutes if someone else wants to ask a question or comment. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah, go ahead.
Could you talk about the relationship? Did you talk about the relationship to the Gospel of John? I think that's prior to
Yes.
this text.
Yes, the Corpus Hermetica is a kind of literary pastiche. It draws upon earlier textual traditions and is commenting on them. So specifically, there's the book of Genesis, there's the opening of the Gospel of John, and there's the Platonic dialogues, particularly the Timaeus. If you want to look at that text, that's the one that is most influencing, because there's an account of the creation by Plato in the Timaeus, and that is being referenced at certain points. One of the interesting things about Gnosticism, of which the Hermetic texts are a type of Gnosticism, or type of Gnostic discourses, is that the scholar of Gnosticism, Juan Culiano, who was a student of Mircea Eliade, and he wrote a very interesting book called The Tree of Gnosis, which is a structuralist interpretation of Gnosticism. And when I say structuralist, what I mean is that he's concerned with the way that these different Gnostic traditions, including the Hermetica, they're treating these earlier texts as they're weaving a kind of myth by reinterpreting, by treating certain motifs from these earlier texts as a metaphor for a certain Gnostic myth that they're articulating. So that's why they pick and choose so much. They don't just sit down and say, okay, well, let's look at the text of Genesis from the beginning to the end and make it all fused together with some kind of sense of orthodoxy. These are heterodox, non-orthodox thinkers who aren't, they're not using Genesis or the Gospel of John to try to reinforce some kind of like Nicene or some kind of other type of more traditional understanding of religion. They're religious radicals who, what they're doing is they have this more radical myth, which is the idea of the gnosis, which is that they've realized that human beings are in some sense already divine, and that these other religious traditions are indicating that at certain points. So they pick out the passages that seem to allude to that, and then they string them along in kind of this new novel interpretation. That's why more orthodox religious thinkers are very alarmed by these Gnostic traditions, because they don't interpret the text they're drawing on in an orthodox way. So for example, the Hermetica refers to the Father and the Son of God, but they don't mean Yahweh, God the Father, and they certainly don't mean Jesus Christ as the Son of God. Instead, they're using those references to refer to this other philosophical notion that isn't necessarily directly, Gnosticism just means knowledge. The word gnosis means knowledge. It's just the Greek word that means to know something. In a spiritual sense, it means we know something about ourselves, namely that we're the location of the divine in the world. We're a locus of that. So rather than the divine being located in another supernatural world that we have to receive grace from to be let into that after death or something like that, in more orthodox versions of religion where we exist in this fallen state, Gnosticism is saying that here and now in this world, we are the gods that we're looking for. And so the idea is that if you can realize that and know that, then the world starts to make sense in a different way, and your life can then be imbued with meaning, and then you can have a kind of purpose to what you're doing, and that you're not just subsumed in the agrarian cycle of existence that grinds you down in poverty, like most people exist in, working at these Roman villas, and they're just toiling away, and it's this vulgar common existence. And so the Gnostics are trying to escape from that. And they're trying to escape from that by forming these societies where they teach you this additional knowledge that you're not just this laborer who's digging in the ground and then you die and then that's the end. And you're a God too. And here's a method and a teaching for you to be able to realize that. It's about 3:30, which is gonna, we're gonna be trying to conclude on time. Does anybody have any final questions or remarks before we close, and then we'll pick this up again next week? No? Okay, well, we're about at 3:30, so I'm gonna leave the room, and then I thank everybody for coming, and we're gonna look next week at Pico della Mirandola, who's one of the great figures of the Renaissance, and he wrote this wonderful little essay about how to be a magus called The Oration on the Dignity of Man, and it's an attack on everything that is negative about life in Christianity. It's an attack on that. And it's one of the great works of the Renaissance, and is really, really one of the founding documents for our own Thelemic tradition. And it's something most people don't know about. The reading is optional. It's about 30 pages. For some of you, you'll be able to easily read that. Don't worry if you don't have time during the week to read it. We'll look at it together, just like we did with this text today. So you don't need to have read it before we arrive in class. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. We'll pick this up again in 1 week. Thanks, everybody, for being in the class. Do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law. Love is the law. Love under will.